Hello and welcome to the Allison Supply Chains podcast. This is the June 2025 episode covering the latest news concerning third-party security posture management and digital supply chain risk. Each month, we pick a few of the industry's most interesting stories and discuss them. If you like what you hear or prefer to read over listening, you can also find these stories in print form. You can join over 14,400 other readers by subscribing to the Allison Supply Chains newsletter over on LinkedIn today. All right, let's get started. I'm your host, Adrian Sanabria, founder of the Defenders Initiative, and joining me is Alexandre Sieira, the CTO and co-founder of Tenchi Security. How are you doing, Alexandre?
I'm fine, man. It's starting to get a little bit cold here in Brazil. It's starting to get winter, but I love it. So, what
Yeah,
about yourself? How are you?
I am busy. As you can see, I'm in a hotel room, and you might not be able to tell from the decoration, but it is in Vegas. So I'm at the Identiverse conference in Vegas, and it's my first time at this conference, and it's interesting because usually when I do these live interviews, which is what pays for me to go to a lot of these conferences, I do live interviews for Cyber Risk Alliance. And this is their conference. They actually own the Identiverse conference. It's usually a general security conference like InfoSec World or RSA or Black Hat, which is kind of mentally taxing because, one interview I'm talking to somebody about large language models and AI and prompt injection. And literally this RSA, like the very next one was on executive protection, somebody who does executive protection, which is now something that a lot of CISOs are concerned about and having to worry about. But mentally, a very big
Yeah.
switch. So, so being at a conference that's just about identity has been really interesting. The conversations have been interesting.
Out of curiosity, was that Black Cloak, the company that does the
Black?
exit protection
No, no, it
called?
was not. Yeah,
Okay,
I've heard of Black Cloak. I've heard a lot of good things about it, but no, that was not Black Cloak.
that's okay. So actually, in last year's RSA, we actually did one of that on podcast Sally, like about Tenchi, those interviews. Yeah.
Hmm.
So pretty busy here as well. I just came back from an event in Mexico about bank and government security. It was super interesting. We're starting our first forays into the Mexican market. Had a many wonderful conversations there. Next week, Tenchi will be sponsoring the banking industry technology conference, which also covers security here in Brazil, the Febraban Tech. So it's also been very busy in travel, and for me going to São Paulo is actually travel. I'm 1.5 hours away from São Paulo. I'm actually staying in São Paulo for the conference, but also a lot of fun meeting people and learning things and talking to people about their challenges and the way they're doing things and learning from them is always super interesting.
Yeah, and next week I go to Armenia. The Central Bank of Armenia has a conference every year, a cybersecurity conference, and right before that they have B-Sides. They have a B-Sides Yerevan. So I'm going to be speaking at both of those conferences, and I'm looking forward to that. I'm not looking forward to the travel. There's just no easy way to travel. No way to get there even in 2 days. It wraps across 3 days getting there. But
Wow.
the way back is quicker thanks to the way time zones work, I guess. But
Okay.
yeah,
So
24 hours of
racking
travel.
up those miles for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, with somebody, I guess. I don't like. There's no way to be picky about what airline you choose on a flight like that. So I'll have them
Yeah.
evenly spread all over all the airlines. All right. All right, so let's get into the stories here. Yeah, there's really looking forward to some of these stories, and I like that as we go across the different podcast episodes here, we get to revisit some stories as we learn more about them as these stories progress. Whether it's a legal case or a breach or details tend to trickle out uh, related to these things, and that's story number one that we have here is this. Cyber attack that accessed the state of Rhode Island's our smallest state here in the United States, their benefit system, and apparently attackers were in there for 5 months before it was discovered. And the third party angle here is that I believe it was Deloitte managing that
Yes.
VPN for them, which not something I realized that Deloitte did, but yeah, very very interesting case, and it's kind of similar to the Snowflake stuff, right? Where now we're talking about, okay, whose responsibility is it when your
Hmm.
account or your stuff gets hacked and somebody else is managing it for you, and you've got
Hmm.
that shared responsibility problem. Um, what if neither party is doing the detection? Like, who's supposed to be doing the detection work there? I remember back when Casby's were new and Adalom, one of the big ways that they hit the news headlines is they discovered that attackers were hitting Salesforce instances and just siphoning out all the data out of these Salesforce instances. And
Hmm.
Salesforce wasn't looking for that. They weren't doing any detection there. They weren't notifying customers. And customers
Hmm.
couldn't do detection there. They didn't have any logs, right? It wasn't until Adalom put this reverse proxy into place that they actually got the visibility into who was logging into the interface and what data they were pulling out of the interface using a trick with SAML to put that reverse proxy into place.
In this case, I think it dovetails nicely with the fact that you're an identiverse, right? Because what happened here, the news story is, I think Deloitte actually like operated the entire product. I'm not sure if they developed and operated or if it's a legacy system. And those companies,
Okay.
Accenture, Deloitte, they also do a lot of IT outsourcing for larger companies and for governments. So I think that makes sense. And what's new is that CrowdStrike conducted an investigation and they published a report. And of course, it's heavily redacted. Not all the details became public, but a few interesting details did. So, for example, the report says that the attacker used Deloitte credentials to log into a non-production VPN
Ooh.
from an external IP address using a non-state of Rhode Island non-privileged account and then proceeded, as attackers do, to move laterally and migrate from non-production to production and escalate privileges and eventually be able to access all the data, right? But to the point of being an identiverse like IAM, we keep talking about this, how outside-in scanning and security scoring does not cover IAM today. And when we do
Hmm.
cover IAM through questionnaires, it's super shallow. Like, do you have a policy that requires this, but you're not actually checking if the controls are working for most of CPCRM? And here it is again. Uh, what seems to be an IAM failure on the part of a third party, Deloitte, having a credential compromised somehow could have been endpoint security as well, as we saw on Snowflake, like someone compromises the laptop of a Deloitte admin and steals credentials or session tokens that way, or social engineering, as we're going to be talking about soon in another story today, and they get credentials this way. But in any case, it was a stolen credential that was used to get the initial access. And from there, uh, once you're past the perimeter on those old environments, it's just a squishy interior and people can just move around and
Yeah.
eventually get the data. And no
Yeah.
tampering or destruction of data, no typical ransomware, just data theft. They confirmed the number of impacted individuals, 644,000 about individuals were compromised. And Deloitte seems to be incurring a cost with this. At a minimum, they covered $5 million for the coverage of the services that people that try to use the Rhode Island system while it was offline with other providers, and also identity theft protection services and credit monitoring for all the people affected. There's probably a lot more cost than that for Deloitte. They had to support all sorts of recovery activities and incident response, etc. So it's not an insignificant bill. I have no idea how big the contract is, but it has a significant chunk of money here. Um, and we keep telling people IAM is the problem. We have no idea, and the report doesn't say if there was 2FA required on that VPN. I'm assuming it was
Yeah.
not, right? Or that somehow the attackers found a way to bypass it. So if there was, it was properly improperly implemented. So very typical scenario here. Not that we know the details, which we didn't when we covered it like a couple of issues ago. And the other thing is, we mentioned we don't know how old this is, how legacy the system is, how much security Deloitte can even put into their operations, because this VPN might be part
Yeah.
of the Rhode Island infrastructure that they have no control over. The customer said that's how you're going to log in, regardless of whether Deloitte thought it was secure or not. We don't know. Losing the credentials is a large fault. If it had to, if they know, probably it's not. We don't know. But the state of Rhode Island implicitly agreed that the system itself has issues because it says it will be transitioning to a new system still because this has
Yeah,
needs to
yeah.
be modernized. So
I have a hot take here. I
okay,
have a I think that so increasingly, I think we need to think of a lot of these old services and protocols, like traditional PPTP, L2TP, IPsec VPNs, with ports exposed to the public internet. Like, there's better ways of doing that now. We have ZTNA. There are ways of doing that without exposing attack surface to an untrusted network, right? Uh,
yes,
and because of that, I think it's just too much risk to have these older. Even if it's fully patched, right? We're still seeing 0 days and stuff like that discovered in these devices all the time. And I think as an industry, we need to think about that. I've been calling them the asbestos of IT. Like it was,
I
building
love it.
material. We found out causes cancer. So we need to systematically rip it out of our infrastructure and replace it with safer materials, and that's where we are with these protocols now. So I think this should be showing up on the cyber insurance questionnaires. I think this should be maybe disqualifying in some of those security questionnaires. Do you have traditional FTP servers, VPNs, file transfer services? Any of these
RDP,
things that are commonly, yeah, yeah, RDP, right?
RDP.
And you can see that stuff with these external scans. So it should be pretty easy for an insurance company to say, your policy is denied. We are not going to cover you until you get rid of the asbestos, until you fully remove it, and we rerun our scan.
Amen. Could not agree more.
All right, let's move on to story two. We've got yeah, some details about the retail attacks in the United Kingdom. So in England, a lot of those, a lot of retail companies getting hit, and it looks like maybe some of those same parties are moving over to the U.S. I saw Victoria's Secret was totally down, and people saying it was ransomware. I don't know if it's the same attackers, but basically we had a bunch of warnings sent out by a lot of parties in the U.S., both private vendors and public ones, saying, "Hey, get ready." They might be moving on from the UK to the US. But yeah, we've got some details here, and apparently the I forget what M&S stands for.
Marks
Uh,
and Spencer. I think it's the name of a large retailer in
Marks
the
and
UK.
Spencer. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, apparently that breach started at a third party, and again, like I hate the language here. The highly sophisticated techniques, and then they say, yeah, it looks like
Ooh,
cred stuffing and social engineering, right? Like something that happens
super
on every
sophisticated.
single penetration test that every company has ever had. So, uh, you know, struggling to see maybe they didn't mention the sophisticated part, but that's certainly not
Maybe the
sophisticated.
attacker was wearing a top hat and like fancy clothes
And a
while they did the
monocle.
engineering. Yeah, or something. That's why he was sophisticated. I don't know. Yeah, I it's become like standard language. It's like we care deeply about your security, but we just got breached. It was a highly sophisticated attacker because, we're awesome and they beat our defenses. So it doesn't matter if they used super basic techniques. We're gonna say they're sophisticated. Yeah. It's a faith-saving exercise that you're gonna see everywhere. It just, yeah, it rubs you the wrong way as well. So very similar to what we just discussed. According to Reuters, they talked to inside sources at the. So the story, by the way, is from Cyber News from reporter Stephanie Shepard, right? The story that we're covering here. But they also mentioned that Reuters talked to inside sources at Marks and Spencers and said that at least two teleconsultancy services (TCS) employees' logins was used as part of the breach. So again, it seems like there was a company that was doing some sort of either contact center or IT outsourcing work for Marks and Spencers, and they had issues either with endpoint security or IAM, which again are disciplines where automated testing outside in external testing will not help you much. And those credentials were used to log into Marks and Spencer systems. So these people had remote access into Marks and Spencer systems, and they were abused by the attackers to then, again, move laterally, escalate privileges, and just own the whole thing. The thing that is different in this case that I find is interesting is that the reporter did a good job and figured out that there's a concentration risk issue here. They found out that TCS, that same provider, which is a huge provider, by the way, and I have to imagine they provide good services at a decent price because they are all over the world and doing business everywhere. Um,
Yeah. Mhm.
happens to be the strategic, I'm going to quote here, happens to be the strategic business partner of not only Marks and Spencer, but also food retailers Co-op, Tesco, Sainsbury's, and Aldi, meaning basically all of the large UK retailers that I know, which doesn't say much, are all using the same provider. So we keep talking about how to be like attackers see third parties as a force multiplier, like you breach one, you compromise many, and this is the case.
Yeah.
And there's a lot that first parties can do when they are hiring a third party to deal with their own risk. But when we talk about this sort of concentration risk, this is like a systemic risk. Like this can have an impact to the economy. Like if all of a sudden a single incident can
Yeah.
take down all the logistics of all of the supermarket chains, you could have like an economic, like a societal problem. And I feel like where this is a scenario where it's not just up to the first parties to require security from their providers, detecting this sort of concentration risk, I think is a job for regulators, right? Either industry self-regulation or government regulators. I know, for example, and this probably happens elsewhere, but here in Brazil, the Brazilian central bank requires banks to disclose any critical third parties that banks and any financial institution has. So if there's a third party that could impact your continued operation as a financial services company, your ability to cash checks or to, pay people, receive
Mhm.
payments, etc. You have to disclose it annually to the central bank, and they're going to be trying to find those sort of concentrated risks and take action somehow on it, right? So that's the thing that I felt was super interesting. Great job, Stephanie, on figuring this out, the reporter here. And it's the same thing. MSPs that are doing IT outsourcing, contact centers that can access transaction records, financial records, medical records, depending on who the first party is. From that first party, you need to minimize the level of control. You need to have proper IAM controls, 2FA or phishing resistant authentication, even better than just regular 2FA. Um, and you need to ensure that those third parties, especially ones with lots of employees, which is the case typically with MSPs or contact centers, that they have good HR control and insider threat controls and security awareness controls. Because once they have a lot of, it's as if you had a team, a huge team inside your own company that deals with sensitive data. You would do those things. You either do it yourself with your provider teams. I see some companies doing that to just extend their insider threat and security awareness programs to their critical third parties, or you require that your third party do it and they have good oversight over this because that's the only way that's going to happen. In an anecdote, in a few countries, in a few examples, we've seen recently with Coinbase, because they were using some Eastern European providers, contact centers, and I've seen stories in Brazil where crime rings either infiltrate people into contact centers or BPOs or
Mhm.
MSPs, so that they can steal data or compromise people from within, not unlike what North Korea is doing with trying to get IT workers into currency exchanges, things like that, but like physical, like real people that have been compromised, right, or that work for them, applying for jobs and getting jobs, um, and or bribing people or threatening people that they find out
Mhm.
work on
Yeah.
the SS locations, right, to get them to do their bidding. So you need monitoring, you need controls. If it's a contact center, for example, the contact center attendant should only be able to access data about the customer they're talking to on the phone and not 100,000 other customers, right? So during the duration of
Yeah.
that call, you can limit their access. There are things we can do, but they're not widespread controls that should be adopted in those relationships to minimize the level of access and like assume breach, assume this is going to happen into your provider. How do you minimize the impact? Right? This clearly didn't happen here, unfortunately.
Yeah. It's I think it's a really good point, an interesting point that we're going to see press releases of companies who have completed post-quantum crypto updates and things like that. But this is how these attacks, these crimes, like we're seeing more and more threats of physical violence and things like that. That's reality. That's why you need to watch these stories, look for the CrowdStrike report, understand the details of how these things actually happen. Read the meta analysis from Verizon Data Breach Report and M-Trends reports like that, because in real life, this is how things are happening. They're not capturing your network traffic, and they're not going to decrypt it with quantum computers. I see this highly unlikely because this works, right? This is effective.
It does. And your questionnaire doesn't cut it. And your external scanning doesn't cut it. It's not going to cover things like that. It's dependent on the
Yeah,
exact relationship each first party has with their third party, the nature of the work they're doing, the kinds of data they have access to. So there's a lot that is bespoke here. And of course, you can't do that level of analysis at scale for thousands of third parties. But you have good criteria to determine who the critical ones are, depending on whatever it is that matters to you, like access to ground rules or to regulated data, supporting critical processes or systems, high levels of access. That's what you have to define your criteria and then really spend the time and do more thorough analysis, as automated as you can, of course, to gain scale. But you have to do it for the critical vendors. And if you have a vendor that is operating your IT infrastructure, you know, hey, that's a critical vendor. Right? As
yeah.
these examples show, both of those stories.
And we need to talk more about resilience and assuming breach and assuming okay, at one of these suppliers, one of the employees might be working for the bad guys, and if they did, how would we detect malicious activity? How would we switch to another provider? If some of our critical providers got ransomware and went down. So again, to that, not only concentration risk, but just operational continuity, just business continuity and things like that. We've got to take that stuff into account because more and more it seems like the attackers are going after operations and revenue directly. And I think we're going to be expected, businesses are going to be expected to have these continuity plans and have backup third parties that we can switch to so that business can continue. And you're not just stuck waiting weeks or a month for your billing provider to get back up and running, or your payments provider, or whoever it might be.
And there's no free lunch. If you try to design a system, and we've seen a couple of companies doing that, like I don't have a single contact center, I have multiple, and I'm like switching the load between them. It's more costly to implement. It's more complicated to manage. You are less relevant to each of those financially, so you have less leverage on either of them when you're trying to impose your conditions. And most importantly, like Dan Gear, we'll be talking about him later again. Um, I'm a big Dan Gear fan, by the way.
Yeah,
Like, he stands for Dan Gear. I love him.
he's the best for quotes. Yeah, so many good
He is,
quotes.
yes. And one of the things he says, quite interestingly, is if you have a single provider, you have a problem with availability. Like if that one thing fails, you're dependent on it. But if you have two and you're doing like load balancing between or have failover between two, both have access to your critical data, say in that example. So if you have two contact centers, so you're splitting the load between them, right? So if one goes down with ransomware, you can continue operating with the other one, even if reduced capacity, which means there are now two different avenues to get to the same critical data. And the attacker now gets to pick which one has the weakest security and use that one. So you're adding up kind of attack surface. So there's no free lunch. You can prioritize availability over security or security over availability. So the best scenario is you have a single provider that has appropriate security and internal redundancies. Having two providers, again, it's a trade-off.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So related to that, I don't think we'll have time to get to it, but there is a story about based on a Ernst and Young survey. about operational impacts topping list of vendor risk worries. So a study there that looks like a survey of business leaders, and I thought that was pretty interesting.
This episode is brought to you by Zanshin, the innovative SaaS solution for third-party cyber risk management that's disrupting the market with a cooperative, continuous, and comprehensive approach. Zanshin is the first product to allow first parties to gain true visibility into their third parties in a non-intrusive way. Gain a deep understanding of how secure your third parties are in key areas like cloud security, endpoint security, identity and access management, and at-risk encryption. Visit Tenchi at tenchisecurity.com to schedule a demo or free trial and see for yourself how enterprise customers are able to reduce third-party risk by 80% or more in just a few weeks.
Mhm.
But our next story is from James Coker, How to Incentivize Security by Design. And I think this is Info Security Magazine
Yes.
is where this was posted. And this is when the whole secure design initiative came out, I believe it was CISA. I saw Bob Lord when he recently left CISA, but he was posting on LinkedIn constantly about secure design, and I just I didn't see it. Like it's there are clear incentives for businesses, and security is not one of them. And posting a voluntary pledge that only cybersecurity providers pretty much signed. The initial list was just a list of security vendors for the most part. I didn't see any incentive for anybody to start prioritizing security all of a sudden and giving up their competitive advantage potentially by doing that. So we need to see better incentives, and I love that this story focuses on that and kind of explores what those incentives could look like, what they could be, and I enjoyed this write up. So like examples they have in there are penalties for easily avoidable vulnerabilities, right? Entire classes of application vulnerabilities like SQL injection that we know how to find pretty reliably and should be able to get rid of before products go to market. So I like that kind of thinking.
Absolutely. I think that's what it will take. It's not sufficient, but would be a great first step. And this is around an event that happened in the UK. There was a panel discussion around this, and people had differing opinions. And this has been a long-running conversation in information security. And I'm strongly on the camp of Dan Gear and others like Fernando Montenegro and Augusto Paz de Barros, and I think Kelly Shortridge as well, if I'm not mistaken. And I apologize if I'm misrepresenting your opinion on this, Kelly, if you're listening. But like, it's about economic incentives. The
Mm-hmm.
information security market is like negative externalities rule everything around me in information security. And to those that are not, let me explain what a negative externality is. It's a concept in economics that means there's a kind of market failure because ideal markets, they work perfectly, they allocate resources in a perfect way, but there's a lot of conditions that no real market ever meets for that to happen. Like the product has to be a perfect commodity that both buyer and seller understand perfectly. It's like iron ore. Iron ore is iron ore. Everyone knows what it is. There's no differentiation, etc. There has to be a huge number of buyers and a huge number of sellers. So there's no monopoly or oligopoly. There's no
Mm-hmm.
monopsony or no oligop. I don't even know what the equivalent is for a monopsony. That's a difficult word to say. Um, so all sorts of problems and negative externalities are one of the many ways in which markets can fail. It essentially means what the person making a decision is not the one that pays the price if they make the wrong decision, right? So I control something, but if I do it badly, someone else pays the price, right? So,
Yeah.
for
Yep.
example, pollution is a classic example. I have an industry somewhere in the river. If I just decide to dump, toxic chemicals on that river, I'm not going to be impacted. But the people downstream, the communities living there, are going to be deeply
Literally
impacted,
downstream. Yeah.
literally downstream. So the classical fix for this in economics is like you have to fix so that the person that does the bad thing, like polluting the river, has to pay a price. So they're disincentivized from doing that. Right. So like
Hmm.
regulation needs to step in. Either the people downstream sue them, and
Fines,
that's the way
enforcement.
that,
Yeah.
or the government even tries to prevent the problem because fines come after the fact. Right. So you ideally want to avoid this because sometimes there are irreversible consequences. And this is happening all over the place in security. And so security by design will never work until we fix the economic incentives. So we just covered this when we were talking about the open letter of the JP Morgan Chase CISO Patrick Opat last edition. But essentially, software, the way it's developed today, the software makers have no liability. They can create as vulnerable software as they
Yeah.
want, and all the contracts either say, as is, no liability, no fitness of purpose. You're making the decision to buy this, no matter how bad it is. It's not my fault. I don't incur any liabilities, or at most, the liability is limited to the value of the contract. Like if you paid $100 for that license, if I create $1 million of losses for you, I will only ever give you back your $100. And you're stuck with the bill of the problem my software created for you of the $999, right? Which is not how any other market works. Can you
Yeah.
imagine if there was a problem in an airplane and then Boeing is not liable? They don't have to fix the other airplanes that are known to have the problem. They don't have incur any liability.
Yeah.
There's a car where people are dying left and right because they have a problem. If you turn left with the turn signal on, it just blows up. Now you signed a contract that said I have no liability.
Right.
It's your fault. You drove it
And
wrong.
you hit on an important point there. Not a. I hate to put it this way, but I remember Wendy Nather was interviewed on this topic a while back, and she said, "Yeah, people are going to have to start dying before these steps are taken."
Mm,
And yeah, I think that's what we're seeing here, and we are seeing hospitals impacted negatively
yes.
to where there is loss of life. It's less direct than safety accidents in the aviation industry or maritime or with vehicles on the roads. So it's a little bit less direct. It's not as closely connected, but as we put computers increasingly into everything, I think it will get there. But yeah, the path is paved in other industries, right? The only question is when does the problem get bad enough that we are forced to act?
As you said, I was about to make that same comment. People are already losing their lives, like ransomware on hospitals because of failures in their IT infrastructure. People are getting worse health outcomes. Like there have been studies on this. There's one example that was tied down precisely to that. Like someone was on an ambulance, got to an emergency room, was turned away because the
Yeah,
hospital couldn't serve them because they were going through ransomware. Had to go somewhere else, and
yeah,
they
they're not
died
going to
on the
make it
way.
to the next hospital. Yeah, hmm
Because it was a critical condition. That there's what's called the golden hour when you're treating people in emergency situations where you have a lot that the mortality rate goes through the roof if you it takes more than an hour for you to start treating whatever they have in a hospital environment. So yeah, people are already dying, so there's no excuse anymore. And on that article, you see a few people from vendors saying, "Oh, but regulation will stifle innovation, and it will lead to security by lawyers." Well, does that mean that no
I,
other industry has innovation? Like, don't we
right.
have security and innovation in the airline business, in the car business, and appliances, and anything else that has
Yeah, it's a
liability for
bad argument.
vendors? It's a
Yeah,
horrible argument. It doesn't stand to
yeah,
scrutiny, right? As a matter of fact, it's much easier to fix problems after the fact in software. Like software patching is way easier than recalling cars or than Boeing
no,
having to go
or an
over and
entire
fix
class of
airplanes.
airplane. Yeah, yeah,
Yes,
the 737 Max. Yeah, that was not
it's
software updates.
it's a lot easier to update software for both the vendor and cheaper for both the vendor and the interested party, especially if the vendor provides good auto patching functionality that minimizes downtime and they don't make it. I'm looking at Microsoft Exchange or SAP or softwares that is super convoluted to update and needs huge maintenance windows and things like that, which is also on the vendor. They created the software like this. They could have made a better job, done a better job. So yeah. So this is, to me, a non sequitur. It's a void argument. It's just a vacuous thing that people say because they don't want to have liability. And the other thing that is said, which shows a very, very deep misunderstanding of on how software markets work, is, oh, if you're getting things badly wrong, the market will penalize you because people stop buying your products. And look, this does happen sometimes,
Not if
right?
you're Microsoft.
Precisely. Like, this is a third-party cyber risk management podcast, right? So of course, if you are a large enterprise, you do have some say over most of the vendors you talk to, right, and suppliers, and you can shape how they do their security. That's why this discipline exists. But let's not kid ourselves. The most critical ones, the vendors that have the most concentration risk, companies like SAP, like Microsoft, like Salesforce, like, they're impervious to the pressure from most of their customers.
Yeah.
A lot of markets in IT and security are monopolies or oligopolies. You have very little choice, and there's huge switching costs. And again,
Mhm.
we don't say that about airplanes. We don't say that about cars. We don't say that about appliances. If you're selling a product and it harms someone, you have to be liable. No matter if you have one or 100 competitors. Why are we doing this here? Right? There should be liabilities if things do go wrong, and there should be minimum safety or security standards that are agreed upon, like you
Mhm.
said, like easily preventable problems. There has to be a minimum standard that people have to follow, um, especially with software that will be executed in high criticality environments. If you're going to sell software that's going to be running in a hospital, in an airport, like on a power plant, I'm sorry, and that includes antivirus, as we just saw with the CrowdStrike outage incident, right? It did
Yeah.
impact companies in those environments because even though it's not made for hospitals, it's not made for airports, it's also used there. So if you want to sell there, there's a minimum standard of care that you need to talk about. So the argument fails because this is not a perfect market, and we discussed already. I'm not gonna relitigate this. Um, is the software market is particularly vulnerable to market concentration. The fact that
Yeah.
software has a very little incremental cost to additional units sold means it's a winner takes all scenario more often than not. You would need a lot of. So the premise that you can switch means that the switching cost is low, that there are alternatives to switch to. Neither of these are true for most software categories. It would take a lot of economic pressure on software providers, a lot of antitrust, action from governments, and the the most important government in this case is the U.S. government, which is more where most of the larger software companies are. Doesn't seem to want to pick up that task. Um, so this is not reality. You're living in a dream world if you think customers have a free choice and can do economic pressure on vendors like that. Sometimes, but it's super limited, super limited. And enforcement, you were talking about like a voluntary pledge. It doesn't work. You
Yeah.
know how governments apply taxes to things like alcohol or cigarettes. They want to disincentivize,
Hmm.
right? So
Right.
if my company volunteers to add additional controls, those controls will cost money to implement if I'm a vendor. I have to allocate people into that. There's at least an opportunity cost. Instead of developing new features that will make me more competitive against the other vendors, I have to do 2FA, I have to do SAML integrations, I have to do whatever it is, logging, etc. Right? Um, so that is a tax on my business. So we're taxing good security. We're disincentivizing good security because if the competitors do not sign that pledge, do not pay that cost, when customers do RFPs, who will have the lower price and more features? The companies that
Right.
did not pay the security tax,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so they will be economically incentivized to not take that pledge or to take that pledge and not actually do the work if they can't get away with it, just to have that signal but not actually spend the money, right? So it has to be fair. It has to be enforced on all the players on the market, right? So there's no advantage to the YOLO companies that try to just wing it, not implement minimum. Again, we're not talking about banking grade security unless you're selling to banks. But like the minimum things like 2FA with no extra cost, SSO with no extra cost, proper logging, good auto patching, things like that. No, default passwords. There are minimum baselines that we could all agree to that should be implementable, right, and enforceable. But it has to be enforced across the board. Otherwise, it's unfair, and it's going to favor the people that don't do a good job. So those
Yeah.
arguments don't stand up to scrutiny at all, at all.
Cybersecurity likes to pretend like it's unique in many ways, and maybe in a few ways it is. But we understand these arguments, and I don't see it fundamentally working differently than it does in other industries, right? It's the fact that it's software. People try and argue that that means it's different, but yeah, everything we can observe, we've got decades of experience with this now. It's in this way, it's not fundamentally operating differently than it does in other industries. So the path does seem pretty clear. It's just how we get there. And maybe one of the ways we get there is you observed, most software companies are U.S. based, and the U.S. is becoming less friendly to deal with recently. We've covered some of those stories, and maybe that their entire website set up, helping you find alternatives to US based software products and services. So, maybe
Yeah,
that helps spin up some of the competition here. And we do have some decent, because I've explored some of those alternatives, and, cloud service providers, not quite there yet. OVH and some of Germany has a few options that seem decent, but there's certainly not a drop-in replacement for an Azure, an AWS, or even a GCP.
they're
So
not.
I think it's going to take more work to have good alternatives there. And I don't know.
But
It's going to take time, no matter what way it happens.
But even if Europe decided to enforce those rules, they either have to enforce it on all vendors, saying so it's not just that like OVH has to implement those baseline security controls, is that if Azure wants to continue selling in Germany, they have to also implement that or
Yeah,
else. Right. So, because otherwise, if people in Germany are still free to buy the cheaper option from the US, which doesn't have all the controls, assuming OVH implemented all of them, right? OVH would still be more costly. Just because of scale, it's more costly probably on a per unit basis because the scale of Microsoft,
yeah,
AWS, GCP, if they want to lower their price, they can, right? Cheaper capital, bigger scale. It's already, again, it's the problem with software offerings, right? They're the first entrance. So, there's a lot of if the enforcement is not consistent, if there's not a lot of work to align those economic incentives well, it's going to be a problem. And I want to be the put on my school teacher hat here and give people homework because I think there are two things they
okay,
should listen to other podcasts, and my marketing people are going to. Hey, why are you telling people to listen to other podcasts? Ask them to listen to the Alice in Supply Chains podcast. But so actually, Black Hat 2014 keynote by Dan Gear, right? It's called Cybersecurity Realpolitik or something, right?
yeah,
Where he talks about a lot of things, and one of them where he lays out a very well thought out proposal for how to implement liability in software with carve outs for open source and all sorts of conditionals there and options to provide flexibility. If people did implement this, I think we would make a major correction in the economic incentives for software in general, not just security, but software in general. Um, and the other thing that I
I
hear
have
people argue,
so many notes from this video.
it's rich, rich content. Like the amount of insight per, word per minute of that
Yeah,
video. I've never found
huge. Yeah,
anything that matches it. So, you know, be in a comfortable place, get a warm coffee or a cup of tea, really listen. Don't multitask on this one. Like watch that
yeah.
video, listen. There's a lot of wisdom there that everyone in the industry should incorporate. And you yourself mentioned cyber insurance, right? I'm a little skeptical that cyber insurance will save us. and it's a whole nother
Mm.
topic we could spend half an hour on. It can
Yeah.
help, but I don't think it will save us. First of all, because it's optional. Some companies will buy cyber insurance and thus incur the tax of having to pay the price to acquire cyber insurance. But the YOLO companies will simply avoid this step altogether, and we have the same unequal enforcement problem we just discussed, unless either first parties or the government say for these particular kinds of software, or if you sell into those industries, you have to have cyber insurance, then maybe, right? But I would invite people to listen to the limitations of even cyber insurance to enforce proper security. There's an episode of, I think it's discontinued, the Scientia podcast. Scientia is spelled Cyentia. If you're not familiar with them, they're put out a lot of amazing security
Mm.
research. You should check out their website,
Yeah.
read the Iris report that just came out, by the way, filled with good insights. But a very old episode, I think from 2020, episode 20, with Daniel Woods, which is a person that really studied risk transfer and cyber insurance in particular. And he lays out all of the limitations on how much cyber insurance can impact the security market. Short version is cyber insurance providers compete amongst themselves, and there's an economic incentive for cyber insurance providers that take up too much risk. They lower their price to close more deals. They take on too much risk. Eventually, that comes back to bite them, but it's years later when the incidents happen. And there's like booms and busts cycles in any insurance market. Cyber insurance is not different. So assuming that every cyber insurance company is going to hold the line and none of them will accept bigger risks is just wrong. So the insured can always shop around for the
Yeah.
less risk averse cyber insurance company that has bigger sales targets to meet, and still avoid that thing of the cyber insurance company is going to require them to have proper security. There'll always be an insurer willing to take them and make a little like quick buck. Essentially, is the argument there.
Yeah.
Market
Jeremiah
failures
Grossman
everywhere,
was
man.
just posting about this on LinkedIn yesterday, and I was ranting in the comments.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's I think that's a great moment to end on there. Those recommendations, that homework. I've not listened to the Scientia podcast, so I will have to check that out. But totally agree on the Dan Gear one. That's one of those where I listen to 5 minutes of it. I pause. I take notes. I just kind of think, look at the ceiling. Like, you have to absorb it. So expect to take. It's a long talk too. If it's, let's say it's an hour long, expect to take at least double that to get through it, because you'll need to pause, think about what he's saying, probably write down some quotes to use in some slides later. Before you continue on to the next thought, because as you say, Sierra, it's very rich with very just kind of mic drop, wisdom you have to drink in and let absorb into your brain.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. And with that, Alexandre, thank you so much for joining me today. Another great conversation. Lot of good topics to talk about.
It was my pleasure. Looking forward to the next edition. Next edition.
And if you liked what you heard and you're on a platform where you can like, subscribe, or leave a comment, or email us or hit us up on socials or LinkedIn or something like that. If there's a story you want to hear us cover, or if you have any feedback for the podcast, let us know. We'd love to hear that feedback. Stay safe and stay vigilant, and we'll see you again next month.